Hello, my name is Jean-Jacques Nantel. In the last video of this series, I showed that Europeans who live on the relatively humid northern shore of the Mediterranean Sea were sedentary producers, while North Africans who live on its much drier southern shore had cultures based on nomadic values. That cultural difference is so important that throughout histories, the two groups never merged to form a homogeneous civilization, even when they shared the same territory, for instance, every time they invaded each other's continents. That age-old opposition between the nomadic and the sedentary culture is extremely important these days because millions of illegal Muslim migrants want to live in Europe without ever respecting its traditions and its laws. There is so much to say on that subject that I decided to make a second video on it. First, let's talk about the Western point of view. Because their ancestors were farmers, most Westerners believe that mankind came out of the inferior classes. They believe that the poor people always made a lot of children who sometimes found a way to join the ranks of the much less prolific middle classes before finally replacing the dying families of the superior classes. That idea seems true, at least in agricultural societies, but it is false, in fact. In reality, all human beings are the descendants of the superior classes. If most modern humans don't know it, it is because they have no collective memory of what happened before the invention of written history, an invention made by agrarian societies. For countless millennia before the invention of agriculture, our ancestors have been the masters of the world. They were dominant predators who fed on everything they stole from wild plants and animals. At the beginning, of course, our ancestors were not dominant predators. They were a species of defenseless monkeys who lived in the trees of the African rainforests and whose biggest fear was to be devoured by leopards and snakes. That situation lasted until some unknown genius invented a new revolutionary secret weapon, the bludgeon. Most weapons invented and used by our ancestors for thousands of centuries, bludgeons, spears, arrows, etc., had the same basic principle. They allowed them to kill animals from afar without risking a direct confrontation with their fangs, their claws, or their horns. As soon as our ancestors had weapons, they stopped being defenseless prey to become dominant predators. We are all the descendants of those winners and survivors. The control of fire has been the next big milestone in our cultural evolution. Fire has been such an important game changer that we can divide our history in two parts, before the fire and after the fire. Not only fire kept away our predators and lit our nights, but it made our food tastier, made many caverns habitable, and cold countries accessible. Without fire, tropical animals like humans would never have been able to conquer and occupy the 5 continents. In a way, the invention of agriculture 10 or 12,000 years ago has been a regression because it transformed the majority of humans into prey. Again, most probably, agriculture has been invented by semi-nomadic women who had to stay near their villages when their men went hunting because of regular pregnancies and because somebody had to take care of the children of the old and sick people, etc. By trial and error, women made agriculture more and more efficient until it became the economic basis of most human societies. The invention of agriculture has been a true revolution for many reasons. First, it transformed our nomadic ancestors into sedentary farmers. They stopped moving all the time. Second, those farmers stopped being predators and became producers. Third, agriculture provoked a fantastic demographic explosion. And fourth, it destroyed many natural environments. Rather than staying at the top of the natural food pyramids, where they could not be many, the first farmers started eliminating those natural food pyramids. They slashed and burned prairies and forests and replaced them with social pyramids populated only by humans and their domestic animals. By eliminating the plant and flesh eaters of the natural world, humans increased tremendously their food supply and their population by eating themselves the plants which grew directly on the soil. Unfortunately for them, by becoming sedentary producers, farmers replaced the prey of the natural world. From then onwards, robbers would always know where to find them and the precious goods they were producing, grain, cattle, horses, young women, etc. Agriculture made them all the more vulnerable because they were spread on very large areas and they could not help each other when attacked. Because they needed peace and tranquility, farmers everywhere had to submit to the rule of some violent people in exchange for protection. Those bandits were to become the superior classes of the agricultural societies, the pharaohs, the kings, and the nobles of the other centuries. In other words, even after the invention of agriculture, some of our ancestors remained predators who lived at the top of the food pyramid. If nobles were rich, even if they didn't work, it was because they were armed and violent. They were pure consumers who stole the production of the inferior classes they ruled, they taxed, and they despised. Being predators, they had kept the nomadic mentality of their ancestors, and like all nomads, they kept marrying people related to them by blood, even if it meant marrying a foreigner. For instance, Louis XIV, the great French king, was half Spanish by his mother and 1/4 Italian by his grandmother. To justify their high standard of living, kings used to say they were kings by divine right. Such a preposterous claim didn't bother people like them who despised the manual work and knew nothing about the real law of our universe because they didn't have to fight against them on a daily basis to produce wealth like the inferior classes. For them, the truth was not what you find when you study nature, but what they read in a holy book like the Bible, a divine revelation they used to justify their stealing and their violence. Because nobles owned vast territories, they regularly had to defend them against other nobles or against the real nomads who came from time to time to plunder their lands. Those nomadic pillages only stopped after the 13th century invention of firearms, a type of weapons only a sedentary society could produce. Because they were rich, nobles used to have more surviving descendants than the inferior classes, especially at the beginning of their dynasty. To give you a striking example of that, biologists have discovered that Genghis Khan was the ancestor of 8% of all the people who presently live inside the limits of the empire he founded. It was during the Industrial Revolution that nobles have been replaced by the entrepreneurs produced by the middle classes. If that new ruling class could replace the nobles, it was because its members used a much more efficient technique to become rich and powerful. Rather than producing like the farmers or the workers, or stealing like the nobles, the nouveau riche started to innovate. They amassed immense fortunes by creating technologies that saved a lot of money and energy. For instance, they systematically built their factories where it was much easier to accumulate a lot of small profits, which means at crossroads, on navigable rivers, or near an ocean. Being the new masters of the world, they quickly learned to do like the nobles, and they started stealing as much as they could from the inferior classes. The three groups I just talked about, the peasants, the middle classes, and the ruling class, tend to live in different places. Peasants live in the countryside, the middle classes tend to live in industrial cities, and the ruling class in a capital, a city which can be built anywhere since it doesn't produce anything real. Capitals are normally populated by pure consumers, mainly civil servants. They are often so artificial that they can migrate on the map with the passing of time. The Canadian capital, for example, moved from Quebec City to Montreal to Kingston to Toronto before ending up in Ottawa, a city built in the middle of nowhere and without a real harbor. If governments often build their capital in isolated places like that and far from industrial cities, it's because they are afraid of the revolution, the coup d'etat, and the riots organized by the large and concentrated population of their largest cities. Throughout history, leaders of starving nations never hesitated to plunder their own peasants in order to feed the dangerous crowds of their largest cities. In the Roman Empire, the emperors used to keep happy the totally useless population of Rome by giving it free bread and free games. In the USSR, Stalin created devastating famine in Ukraine and in Russia only to feed the population of his newly built industrial cities. If I told you that about our own superior classes, it was to show you that the present integration problem Europeans have with their migrants is not due to an opposition between Arabs and Europeans or between Muslims and Christians, but to the much older opposition between the values and lifestyle of nomadic predators and the values and lifestyle of their sedentary prey who produce wealth. During the 20th century, progress has almost eliminated European peasants who were forced to move to cities. As a result, the European birth rate fell well below what would be necessary to replace the existing generations and the existing workers. This has been the main reason behind the present invasion of Europe by millions of poor Muslim migrants. As I explained in the last video, modern Muslims are psychologically and culturally nomads who keep defending the values of a 7th century nomad like Muhammad. This is why they cannot be and will never be assimilated by Europeans. Everything I said about our own superior classes, who even today remain predators at heart, remains true for the Muslims. Like all the superior classes of history, modern Muslims tend to despise manual work and the inferior classes who produce the goods they consume. A simple anecdote will show you how different their mentality can be in that domain. Once, Muhammad saw a plow in the house of one of his Medina followers, and he said, "When that instrument enters in a house, humiliation soon follows." Such a declaration is somewhat shocking for modern Westerners who are used to see the farmers as the noble workers who feed the nation. Like our own nobles, Muslims refuse to accept the scientific truth that contradict what is written in their own holy book. For them, science is more or less useless, since they can always find out about the reality of this world by reading the Quran or the declarations of a prophet who lived 1400 years ago in the middle of a desert. The most shocking behaviors of modern Muslims come from their age-old nomadic values. If their extremists are more violent than ours, it is because by nature predators are violent. If they don't respect the borders established by sedentary societies, it's because nomads never did, nowhere. They have their own set of borders. If they marry inside their community and form separate societies inside the agricultural societies they invade, it is because nomads always formed separate nations and never shared the values, beliefs, and lifestyles of sedentary people. If they veil and segregate their most beautiful women and ask old, ugly, or frustrated women to keep an eye on them, it is because their nomadic ancestors used to spend a lot of time away from their homes, sometimes for months. If Muslims openly discriminate against non-Muslims, it is because predators never respect the reciprocity principle when they deal with their prey. The reciprocity principle I'm talking about has been found in almost all human cultures. Philosophers call it the golden rule. Treat others as you want to be treated. Because they were told that their destiny was to conquer and rule the rest of the world with their values, their laws, and their taxes for non-believers, Muslims keep complaining about the humiliations they suffered during the colonial time or during the Crusades 700 years ago. But they refuse to present any excuses for their own slave trade of Africans as well as Europeans, which lasted for more than 1,000 years, for the Armenian genocide committed in Turkey at the beginning of the 20th century, or for all the crimes committed in India or in southeastern Europe during centuries. Muslims criticize Angola, who forbade the constructions of mosques on its territory, but they find totally normal that Saudi Arabia impedes the construction of churches on its territory. They complain about the long delays they face in Europe to get full citizenship, but they refuse to give it to the foreign workers who live in their homelands. That injustice is obvious in a country like Saudi Arabia, where there are many well-paid jobs with two workers, the Arab who receives the salary and the foreigners who does the job for him. Millions of Saudis are pure parasites who don't work and never did. This is the reason why the new economic plan unveiled in 2017 by their future monarch to reduce the kingdom's dependency on fossil fuels is not gonna work. For his vision 2030 to work, his lazy subjects should change their work ethic and become hard-working professionals in less than 13 years. Obviously, this is not gonna happen. If we take into account all the discriminations Muslims have been guilty of all over the world and throughout history, how can they complain against Islamophobia as if it was a sort of racism? Because Islam is not a race, it is an ideology, and an ideology which openly discriminates against non-Muslims. It is normal for people to dislike an ideology that discriminates against them. In South Africa, blacks were apartheid phobes. In the USA, they are Ku Klux Klan phobe. Jews were Nazi phobes. Palestinians are Zionist phobe, and non-Muslims are Islamophobes. If it is a moral duty to respect every single human being, there is no moral duty to respect an ideology which openly discriminates against us. If a nomadic ideology like Islam could make such a strong comeback during the last decades, it is of course because many Muslim countries were petroleum rich, but it is also due to the rapid mass urbanization of their very large rural populations. In other words, the strength of the present-day Islamic revival is largely due to the arrival in town of millions of ignorant peasants who don't want to hear any discussions about their faith. And as usual, the ruling classes of those countries use the phenomenon to serve their own interests. Seneca once said, "Poor people believe their religion is true. Educated people believe it is false, and the ruling classes believe it is useful." Nowadays, Islam doesn't invade Europe. Muslims do. At the beginning of that immigration wave, Europeans thought they were importing servants who would wash their dishes and clean their toilets, only to discover that Muslims were in fact bosses who came in Europe to give them orders. In many European cities, Muslims created closed neighborhoods where women wear veils and where some strange foreign-born Islamic policemen patrol the streets and order European passers-by to stop drinking beer or wear miniskirts near their neighborhoods. To get rid of fascism, Europeans had created democracies based on political correctness, an ideology which degenerated so much during the last decades that today Islamists are using it to impose their own brand of fascism in Europe. Europeans had eliminated the death penalty and torture from their legal system, only to hear Islamists proclaim that they want to impose their Sharia all over Europe with all its most primitive forms of punishment like decapitation, stoning people, cutting hands, etc. And we didn't talk about the many suicide attacks which regularly kill dozens of innocent people. Europeans had created neutral tribunals to judge criminals, and nowadays some self-proclaimed imams condemn to death European artists like Salman Rushdie. By chance, the vast majority of Muslims, at least in the Western world, keep repeating that Islam is a religion of peace, and most seem sincere about it. In fact, despite all the noise made by the fundamentalists about the growing number of Muslims in the world, there are reasons to believe that Islam is actually losing strength. First, most young Muslims are now educated and are fully aware of the most obvious scientific errors found in the Quran. Second, that evolution seems impossible to stop now because of the internet, a system which puts them in contact with the thinkers of all the other civilizations. Islam is no longer a closed world where dissenters and free thinkers can be controlled by a bunch of ignorant mullahs. In the coming years, the internet should have a much more corrosive effect on Islam than the printing press had on Christianity since the Renaissance, and that dissolution should be much faster because high-speed internet creates a much faster acceleration of history than printed books. In the Western world, it is more and more common to meet former Muslims, especially women, who no longer believe in Islam, who live like Westerners, who marry them, and who sometimes take their husband's name in order to disappear in the crowd. The present decline of Islam should be accelerated by the rapid elimination of its two main sources of power. First, the development of alternatives to fossil fuels will rapidly decrease their price and the power of the oil-producing nations. Second, the surpluses of young Muslims produced by older generations will soon disappear in multiple wars which together promise to be as long and deadly as the European Civil War, which lasted from 1914 to 1945. Nowadays, in the Middle East, hundreds of thousands of Muslims are killed in civil wars where each side uses the most modern weaponry to kill their fellow citizens, where minorities are exterminated, and where extremists execute anybody they dislike. And above all that, there is the fact that the Middle East is the real center of the old world, a center which is now submitted to the convergent attack of the armed forces of USA, Europe, Russia, China, India, and Black Africa, who all try to kill as many extremists as possible. By the way, it's not true that when you kill an extremist, 10 others rise to take his place. The reason is simple. Each generation can produce only a small fraction of fanatics who are ready to die only to kill a handful of enemies. None of the Nazis the Allies killed during the Second World War has been replaced by 10 others. Dead dogs don't bite. The decline of Islam is also made inevitable by the extremely rapid collapse of the fertility rates in the countries it controls. As I showed in the last video, that collapse is so brutal and has so much momentum that very soon the average Muslim family could produce as few children as the European families, maybe less. As you can check with the bibliography I will put at the end of this video, such a catastrophic collapse already happened in East Asia, where many regions and countries, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong for example, produce about one child per woman. We're talking here about a worldwide phenomenon. The collapse of Islam could be even more rapid and spectacular if its extremists trigger an atomic war with a nuclear power like Israel. If that was to happen, the acceleration of history would have solved another pressing problem near its source. It's a pity, but that's clearly what is brewing in the Middle East these days. We have been unable to stop the destruction of Europe between 1914 and 1945, and we will probably be unable to stop the destruction of that other great center of civilization called the Middle East. It's history. I thank you in advance to subscribe to my channel, to recommend this video to your friends, and to give it the thumbs up. See you next time.